Hi, my name is Maureen Driscoll, and welcome to my 7-part series on how to write a romance novel. Today is part 4, the non-outline outline. And I have 3 tips for you. Tip number 1, pantsers versus plotters. If you've never heard the term, pantser is somebody who writes by the seat of their pants. And so they just sit down at the computer and they just go where the muse tells them to go. Plotters are people who like to outline, like basically everything that they want to have in the story will have come from an outline, oftentimes very detailed. And a lot of times plotters, if it's in the outline, it's in the book. If it's not in the outline, it's not in the book. Like they can be very strict with that. Bottom line, as far as what's better, is whatever it is that gets you to the end of your book is the thing you should be doing if you're happy with your books. So there are merits to both, and I'm someone who's done both of them. But I now come down somewhere in the middle, which is where I get to my non-outline outline, which is the purpose of this episode. I had one book, it was the 6th book of my first romance series, and it just wasn't working. I had worked on it, I think, for like 5 or 6 months, and just like, oh, this is just not happening. I've been just toiling away, and I like parts, but I don't like parts, and I don't know how to fix it. And I ended up, and it took me a while to get to the point where I knew I had to do this, but I threw out 120 pages. And that was 120 manuscript pages. And since there's about a page and a half, or for every manuscript page, it's a page and a half of book, that 120 pages of manuscript translated into 180 pages of the book. And my books are usually only like 260 to like 290. So that's a huge chunk. And it's not something I could have reused. So it basically, I mean, I didn't have the heart to just go delete permanently. I think I put it in a different document, and I was like, well, maybe I'll just leave it here for a while and see if I need it. I did not need it. I did not go back to it. It's good that I left those out. And then at that point, I went back and I was like, all right, let's see these characters. Where are they going? What are we going to do with this? And the book I ended up with, which actually went pretty quickly at that point because I wasn't trying to play with things that just were not working. I like that book. It's one of my most popular books, but it was painful to go through that process. So I was like, okay, never again. Fast forward a couple books later, it happened again. But this time I only threw out 60 pages of manuscript, which is 90 pages a book. So it was a little better. But at that point, I really did say enough is enough. And I still didn't cross over into the plotter side, but I did come up with something that I call the non-outline outline, which we'll get to soon. Plotting people, for the most part, I have heard fewer complaints from people who really plot, who really outline. But I do think that a disadvantage to that is if you get blinders on and you're just like, oh, I'm just going to do this, and nothing is going to end up in the book that wasn't in the outline. Because I think sometimes you can miss things along the way, because one of the joys of writing is when your characters take on a life of their own, when they'll come up with things you're like, whoa, I didn't see that coming. It's fun. And if you listen to the muse when that happens, you can come in, you can go in directions that you didn't think you could go to before. And in my second Regency novel, it was Always True to Her. No, that's not, I don't know. You know what? I can't remember the name of it, but a whole character came to life in the middle who had never been part of any of my planning up to that point, and is one of my favorite characters. So those happy surprises happen. I will explain, now that I've told you all my anecdotes, I will explain the non-outline outline in the next segment. Tip number 2 is to divide your book into segments. I generally, with my outlines, they're pretty small. Like they're generally on like one piece of paper, maybe 2 pieces of paper by the time I start writing. And what I do is I divide the book with my vision into 12 major segments. It's very similar to what we do with screenplays. Uh, most books, all books, should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And with novels, it's generally the beginning and the end are roughly the same size, and then it's the middle portion, the horrible, vexatious middle portion. When people get stuck in a book, it's always in the middle. It's never the beginning for the most part. It's always in the middle because you're like, what else can these people do? So I'd come up with 3 major points that should happen in the beginning of the book, 6 in the middle portion, and 3 in the end. And I'm going to break down into what I'm talking about major things. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break down the movie, The Wizard of Oz, just because you've maybe seen it, hopefully maybe seen it. And there's rarely a book that everyone has read. So I'm just going with a movie everyone has seen. But if we're talking about a book everyone should have read, it should be Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice. It's the best. It's my favorite book. But we're not going to do that. We're going to do The Wizard of Oz. So in what I call the first act, and because in screenplays we do 3 acts, in the first act of The Wizard of Oz, the first major thing that happens really is Miss Gulch takes Toto. This is extremely important because if someone doesn't take Toto away, if Dorothy doesn't lose her dog, Dorothy does not leave the farm. She stays there forever. She's just singing and helping the field hands and just that forever. That's it. That's it. There's no moving whatsoever. So in your book, you're going to want to come up with the one thing that really starts the ball rolling. And for the most part, even though we want our heroes and heroines to be active in the choices that they make and in the things they do in the book, this first major thing is often something that happens to the person. Like all of a sudden it's like, whoa, Miss Gulch comes and takes takes Dorothy's dog away. What's she going to do? Type of thing. So it's a great passive thing to happen. But when Dorothy says, okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to run away from home. So that's the big first thing that happens in the book. The next thing is she meets Professor Marvel, who makes her realize how much she loves her family. And she's like, oh, I'm going to go back. I'm not going to run away. So she goes back to the farm, but of course chooses a very bad time to do it and gets swept up in the tornado and lands in Oz. So that's the first part. It's the beginning of The Wizard of Oz. That's now done. Now in Oz, the first thing it does is she wakes up and she's like, whoa, the whole I'm not in Kansas anymore. So that's the first thing. She just learns about this incredibly new, strange world to her. The second is that she meets the witch and gets threatened by the Wicked Witch of the West. So she's like, oh, I have made an enemy. The third thing is that she goes off because she has been told you've got to go meet the wizard. She meets allies along the way. She meets these very nice, Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Cowardly Lion. She's like, okay, so it's new characters. So this is a wonderful thing. She has allies. Okay, and then she gets a little bit of peril because the witch tries to I don't know if kidnap is the right word. I don't know what it's the poppies, and she falls asleep in the Cowardly Lion, and they have to have Glinda, who's kind of does do the mind games. Glinda does the snow, and so they wake up. But this is the peril that happens. And then she does meet with the wizard, who then says, "You got to go and get the witch's broom." And she's like, "Well, I'd have to kill her." And he's like, "And?" So she has to go to the castle, and in the meantime, she gets kidnapped again. Is it kidnapping? I don't know what you call it, but whatever. The monkeys come and they take her, and she ends up in the castle. And then her friends are like, "Oh my gosh, Dorothy's in the castle. She's going to die. We've got to rescue her." So that is the whole second act. And we're also at a point where, like, okay, this is really this big momentous thing because there's peril. Dorothy could die. Also Toto. And we have to rescue our friend. So this is a huge moment of it's danger, it's suspense, it's like a really climactic point in the book, or excuse me, in the movie, and it's about 2/3 of the way through. And then the third act is her friends do rescue Dorothy. Dorothy does, although she does a pretty good job rescuing herself. Dorothy gets the broom, they go back to the wizard, and the wizard, of course, gets found out to be fake. And then but he's like, I'm going to take you home. And so they go home, and then they try to go home. She wakes up at home, and she's like, oh, there's no place like home. And it's like this, even though but in some respects, they're sort of telling young girls that they shouldn't explore the world, which I don't like that either. So I don't know. It's kind of problematic. But that is how you break it down. Those are basically 12 steps that will explain the major scenes in The Wizard of Oz, the major bits of action. So what you need to do is if you can explain The Wizard of Oz in 12 steps, you can definitely fit your novel into 12 steps. You just have to figure out what they are and how to get there. This is about putting everything together. And the first step is to, especially if you don't like outlining, is to not think of this as an outline. This is the non-outline outline. And we're going to put everything together that we've learned so far. The first episode was dedicated to genre. So you know the genre, or you should, that you're writing in. You know the types of stories that are generally told. You know the norms of what happens to these stories. If we're just being generic in this whole thing, more or less these things apply in almost all genres, which is you get to introduce the characters and the setting. You introduce what the problem is, whether or not this person, again, if we're going back to our cupcake baker, she's like, oh, I really want to win this contest. You come up with what the problem is. You attempt to solve it once, and that does not work. You attempt to solve it twice, and that does not work. You figure out, like, oh gosh, I gotta get this. I gotta solve this in a third time. You're setting up this, like, all hope is lost. Like, this is really like the ratcheting up the tension. You gotta, do this. And then you do the thing that either it works or it doesn't work, and you resolve it. You get your happily ever after, or not. But generally you kind of got to in romance. And then you got the end of the story. So even if you just take those steps, it's the intro of the characters and the setting, intro of the problem, attempt number 1, attempt number 2, like, oh, what am I going to do? Reemphasize how big the stakes are, and then whatever this thing is to try to solve it the final time, and it either works or it doesn't, and then you resolve the situation, and you got the happily ever after. Even if that is your outline, and you put those down on a piece of paper, and then you just fill in the blanks. Look at me. I'm always assuming people are doing stuff on paper like it's 1950 or something. I still do things on paper, but you probably do things on the computer or the phone. I don't know how you write, but that's it. Even if you just do those steps and fill them in, you've come a long way, Miss, seat of the pants writer. So that's a really good thing to do. Now, if you want to go a little bit further, remember how we talked about characters, and I asked you to do, what does this person say they want? What do they truly want? And how do you resolve those things? So whatever the answers for those are, you can start putting them in, just, plugging them into the section on who she is. And it's also going to be like what she does, what the attempts are, what her problem is, which brings me to part 3, which is obstacles in conflict. You were supposed to come up with the conflict and how this person, this thing that she wants, what's standing in her way. And you're going to go through all these different ways to solve this, like for her to achieve her goals. So those are going to be things that get plugged into your outline as well. And you just keep doing this as much as possible until you have not necessarily every single thing that you need in this book, but it is going to give you a pretty good blueprint to get you from the beginning to the end without having to throw out 120 pages like I did, because it was not good. So do better. Don't do as I say. Well, actually do this, but don't do as I did, I guess. Do as I say. Okay. Thank you for joining me for part 4 of my 7-part series on how to write a romance novel. If you liked this, please give it a thumbs up and a comment. And also please share it with anyone who might find it useful. And I will see you in part 5, hopefully, which is getting to the actual writing portion, which, yikes, no one likes that.